I want to start by telling you a biological story. A biological story that is also my own origin story. And origin stories are important. In mythology, they refer to narratives of how the world began and why certain things in the cosmos have certain qualities. And in comic book terminology, the purpose of an origin story is to explain how certain characters became superheroes or supervillains. So across a wide range of subject matter, origin stories have cultural significance. And this one is mine. So I was born a twin, or I was created a twin, which my parents learned about with delight and I'm sure a little bit of terror when the two of us were 3.5 months along. And for a month, they let that delight and surprise of twins sink in. A month when my father was still in school and my older sister, then 2, was running around, and they began to imagine that life with twins. And then at 4.5 months, the doctors discovered that there was a problem, something that is now called twin-to-twin transfusion, a systemic imbalance in the blood supply. It meant that my twin sister was noticeably smaller than me, a difference worrisome enough that they started monitoring us closely. The inequity was endangering both of our health. These days, there are medical interventions that have a very high success rate in correcting that inequality, but at the time, all they could do was watch. And at 6 months along, my little twin sister died in utero. And for the next 3 months, we remained in there together, being monitored daily as I kept growing, curled around this other being, until the medical team decided it was too risky for me and my mother, and they should induce labor. And I was born reasonably healthy and destined to tire them out as much as 2 of us would have. So for my whole life, I've been curious about this story, fascinated by twins for personal, biological reasons. And I've become fascinated by them again because of the work I do around climate justice, because of the lessons we need to learn collectively about living together in closed systems with finite resources, lessons about creating systems that allow us all to thrive, about relearning how to live together as humans and come out alive. My earliest lesson was about sharing, and in an acute scientific sense, I didn't learn it in time. Not that I could have. Instead, I learned another lesson, one that continues to resonate deep in my body after all these years, which is that we need each other, that we were made for one another. And I don't just mean that in a hallmarky way, I mean all of us. We were made of one another, for one another. I know this as a biological mother, having gestated one baby that died before birth and another baby that survived inside my own belly. I know it as a stepmother, having stayed up late, rubbing my daughter's back so that she could fall asleep. I know it as a friend and an activist and a sister. The beginning of my origin story isn't much different from yours. I was made as a collaboration between love and science and human flesh. My body from the beginning, a site of life and death. Every pound of me, a yelling, fighting piece of interdependent creation. So that's my biological story. I also want to go back to that biblical story we just heard, the second creation narrative in Genesis. It's an origin story too, and one that I suspect you know. So God forms Adam out of soil, his name coming from the Hebrew word for earth, and then he forms all of the animals of the field and the birds of the air from the ground as well. But Adam is lonely and he wants a companion. So God puts him to sleep and removes one of his ribs, and from that rib creates Eve, whose name means to breathe or to live. Now, there are lots of gender implications that come out of this story, or lots of male theologians have created lots of gender implications out of this story, and I'm sure organized all-male panels on the matter. And I am, with some self-restraint, not even going to go there, because there's another angle on this creation narrative that interests me more, and that is the fact that in this particular origin story of ours, we have a different relationship between one another than the other animals. We're told that Adam looks at Eve and says, "This is now bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." We are made of soil and of one another. We're not isolated entities, even the strongest or most introverted of us. We're in this together. We were, in biology and in the Bible, made for one another, of soil and of one another. So we've done biology and we've done the Bible. Now I want to tell you a modern day human story. And I think you know this one too. This is the story of hotter summers and fiercer storms and rising waters. And the way I tell it, radical environmentalist that I am, it's the story of massive multinational oil and gas companies hiding and then delegitimizing science and paying off governments in order to commit crimes against the planet that have resulted in millions of deaths, all for their own absurd amounts of profit. It's a story that terrifies me and that sometimes doesn't make me much fun at dinner parties. But this is also the story of an increasingly unstable economy, particularly in areas reliant on those oil and gas corporations, which makes it the story of workers struggling to support their families, communities crumbling, homes foreclosing, and increasing suicide rates. Told that way, it is still a story of fear and vulnerability, and it is still no fun. And there are many other stories here. The vulnerability of indigenous populations witnessing the mass destruction of their sacred land by gratuitous extraction projects after centuries of destruction to their culture and people. The vulnerability of small island nations literally losing homes and bones to the sea. The vulnerability of the global poor, unable to mitigate and adapt to a problem they had no hand in causing. The vulnerability of scientists struggling with the implications of all of their studies and no corresponding action. The vulnerability of young people who were taught to believe that their best years lie ahead. All sorts of people are scared about this story. So, a couple weeks ago, Lonnie shared with us a little of his own learning about engaging tough issues on social media, and in that vein, I have a confession of my own on the matter. I once got into a Facebook debate about climate change, and I say once because I really try to avoid it, except this one time. It was following a bunch of media buzz about the LEAP Manifesto, a social movement call to action created by leaders from dozens of social movements across Canada. The LEAP Manifesto proposes that we need to address climate change in a way that respects Indigenous rights and lessens inequality. It declares that austerity is a manufactured crisis at war with life on Earth. So, whatever you might have heard of it, it's worth actually reading the whole document. But the mainstream media didn't love it. And when the LEAP Manifesto started making headlines, fears and vulnerabilities about the climate story exploded. A labor leader I know here in BC wrote an article about how tone-deaf the LEAP was, which he posted on Facebook and which received many supportive responses from among his circles. One of these responses was from a worker in Alberta's oil patch who posted a critique that these urban environmentalists don't have any skin in the game. And I took the bait I responded, hopefully gracefully, but who knows how these things come across. I responded that I can see how it would feel like that, except that the thing about climate change is that we all literally have skin in the game. We're all afraid, we're all involved, all of us together. In the media, much of the LEAP debate became about whether it was the LEAP's fault or Rachel Notley's fault that people were experiencing economic insecurity. The two of them were pitted against one another and both pitted against workers in those industries, which in my mind was ridiculous, and it totally let off the hook the largest source of that economic insecurity, these transnational oil companies, the most profitable in human history, who were content to make oodles of money on people's labor when oil prices were high, and then skip town when the prices dropped. So my Facebook sass did not solve that problem, but it was a reminder to me that our bodies, each of our own individual sites of brokenness and healing, full of muscle and scar and constantly regenerating cells, they are connected to the land and they are connected to one another. They are our reminders. They are our skin in the game. So lately, the whole climate conversation in this country has been rooted in a bizarre new denial, with the mainstream media and industry groups pitting everyone against everyone else, and then politicians reassuring us all that we can have all that we want: project expansion and emission reduction, pipelines, and the Paris Agreement. Our Prime Minister says that he's got it all under control. Many of our premiers, ours, Alberta's, Ontario's, have climate leadership plans, but they don't get us even close to where we need to go. There's an enormous gap between the science and how we're responding. And in that gap, we're seeing a new old conversation emerge, a conversation about civil disobedience, which is ultimately a conversation about using our bodies as tools in defense of the land from which we come, in defense of the science and the theology of interdependence. Across the globe, communities are rising up, laying their bodies on the line to resist dangerous extraction projects that threaten life itself. And across BC, as you know, these resistance efforts are interwoven with a brutal history of colonization and a powerful story of reclamation. So if the biological story connects our bodies to one another, and the biblical story connects our bodies to the land, then it isn't a complicated geometry to draw a line from there to this climate story and back around again. It doesn't seem like too much of a stretch to imagine times when breaking state laws seems more conservative, more responsible than abiding the continued breaking of natural laws. And standing on the edge of that enormous chasm between science and our inadequate shared response, I have never felt more ready. After all, my body is already a site of struggle, of resistance, of life and death. My body holds millions of origin stories, a few of which I think of all the time, and most of which I don't remember or was never aware of. Yours is the same. In this modern climate story, there will be moments of great reclamation when we are invited to show up in big ways for the future of humanity. These moments are already happening and will continue. Mass gatherings, large-scale acts of civil disobedience, and we will remember them. We will remember how we chose to show up. And like in the microbiology of our own physical form, there will be a great many more smaller moments which we may or may not remember, may never be aware of, in which the life and death of this modern climate story continues. Moments of words spoken, petitions signed, votes cast, of showing up again and again, even when it's not clear the impact. Moments that build muscle memory to prepare us for great reckoning and that remind us of what has been true since the very beginning, that we were made of and for one another. So that birth story, that Bible story, that human story of how we were made of flesh and of dirt and of a longing for one another, that is my favorite story. And my hope is that collectively we can learn to live it. Let it sink into our bodies, see it in the faces of those around us, retell it again and again and again, in story, in deed, small and large. I may be a radical environmentalist with a bad track record on sharing right from the very beginning, but I know this: we all have skin in the game, and we will use it to pull one another through. May it be so.